First, big thanks to OECD for inviting me here. The title, this is the title I was given. It's not, and what I'm going to talk about is not exactly this. The reason is there isn't really a big issue about pollution from the infrastructure associated with aquaculture. Rather, it's the aquaculture itself, as I hope I make that clear. I thought I'd start with saying something about fish and aquaculture, and I'm pleased to say that that's been a little bit, thank you, that's been a little bit covered by earlier speakers, and my figures, or my organisation figures, sort of more or less tie in with those we've heard. I mean, how big is fish? It's pretty big. We heard earlier figures for the marine economy, about 2.5 trillion. We reckon fish, and that includes shellfish, seaweeds, etc., alone is about 1 trillion. And that excludes things like fishing boats, etc. This is just the fish that is got from capture fisheries and from aquaculture. And it employs many people, probably about, we reckon, 50, 60 million. But the livelihoods of many others are directly tied to this as well. So it's a very large number. And it's interesting when you look at this, over the last 50 years, since the mid-1960s, the per capita supplies and consumption of fish have more or less doubled, while at the same time we've gone from a population of about, well, it's doubled as well over the same 50 years. So that's some going. And the first half of that period, the increase in supplies came very much from capture fisheries, and through a huge investment in fishing, in fishing boats and in new technologies and so on. But since about 1990, when basically capture fishery supplies have flatlined, it's been aquaculture that has really come to the fore. Since about 2014, according to our figures, aquaculture now supplies more than half of all aquatic foods that we eat, which is quite a staggering figure. It may be not entirely clear from that figure because there's a little bit in the middle there in the blue that's marked fish meal and fish oil, and still about 20 million tonnes of capture fish fisheries caught from capture fisheries, fish caught from capture fisheries are reduced to fish meal and fish oil and used primarily in animal feeds, and actually a lot of that in aquaculture itself. And the question for us in FEO is whether this growth in aquaculture, which is seen as being the only way to maintain, or even as research indicates, consumption is going to actually increase, per capita consumption is going to increase. The only way this can happen is going to be through aquaculture. Capture fisheries are going to take decades, the populations on which they depend are going to take decades to rebuild before we can really increase any significant fishing pressure on them. But there are a lot of issues around this, and some of these we've heard already today, and you heard from the last presentation from Professor Buck. One of the key issues in aquaculture is how are we going to feed all these farmed aquatic animals? And then also in his talk, it was apparent where can we farm them in an increasingly congested and contested coastal zone. And one of the, again from Professor Buck's talk, there was this issue implied about climate change and how can we build aquaculture that's going to be able to cope with increases in storminess, changes in salinity, changes in acidity, changes in dissolved oxygen temperature, etc., etc. And then going on to that one in red, which is the question that I'm going to address today, how can we reduce waste from aquaculture? And I'm going to finish with a few conclusions and ways forward. Again, this part is made a little bit easier for me because Professor Buck showed a few similar slides. Mine are a bit more tropical oriented. This is seaweed farming on the top left in the tropics. This is in Kiribati, and this is largely, most seaweed at the moment goes for alginates, which go into cosmetics, food like ice cream, chocolate, if you believe that, or it may surprise you to know that. But anyway, this is what it's largely used for, but increasingly seaweeds are being grown for food directly. Then we have mussel ropes, and you saw a few pictures of those. These are grown all over the temperate and tropical world. And then the intertidal zone in the top right is showing oysters being farmed in bag culture, very common way of doing this. On the bottom three, on the left we have shrimp farming in the Philippines. A lot of tropical shrimp now globally traded, and most of you will be familiar with it. The thing to see here is just how big these ponds are, how much energy is being used, a lot of aeration, power for moving water around and pumping and exchanging water and so on. The middle picture in the bottom, these are very typical of the kind of ponds you see in throughout the subtropics and tropics, used to grow carps and tilapias and things. And then over to the right we have a marine fish cage. A bit unusual, this one. This is people farming tuna in South Australia. And these are kind of blocks of frozen pilchards being thrown in. Aquaculture is not a consequence-free activity. In fact, you could argue no human activity is really a consequence-free, particularly for the environment. And basically, in a nutshell, this is what it does. It uses inputs of energy, capital and labour to convert resources into food, and as a consequence of that, it produces waste. So the kind of things we need are land or space in the sea, we need water, we need young fish or young shellfish to stock, and we very often need to use feed to increase the growth rate. And there we see our fish farm there. These are cages in Scotland, and on the other side we see the product, and there we see the consumers at the far end. And the kind of waste that are generated are usually uneaten food, and you've got fecal and urinary products. There are chemicals very often used to treat disease, and you have pathogens that are being released from the farm, and you also have escaped farmed animals. And this consumption of resources, this production of wastes, make demands on environmental services, and the kind of impacts we see down the line are resource depletion, habitat loss, reduced biodiversity, food web changes, reduced ecological services, and disease. Not all of them necessarily, but these are the sorts of things that you can see. So, let's look at where all these sorts of things come from. There's a sort of schematic of a cage, and it's got fish in it, and you can see that in order to make these fish grow, we're having to add food. Some of it doesn't get eaten, and of course the fish are producing waste themselves. Nets, if they're damaged or if there's some sort of mistake made during moving fish around from one unit to another, the fish can escape. So, okay. The solid and dissolved organic wastes derive primarily from waste food, fecal and excretory products. And you can see here, we're throwing in some food, some of which, hopefully almost all of it, the fish will eat, but there is some that inevitably gets lost. And then the fish digests this, and what it can't digest, it passes out as fish poop, and then it absorbs and metabolizes what it can digest. And this is what makes the animal grow. But inevitably, you have excretory products at the far end. Whoops. And it's this combination of dissolved wastes and solid wastes that are typically produced from a fish and from shrimp farms. Now, we can reduce feed losses by understanding better what determines fish appetite. And there's a lot of research going on into this in biological laboratories, in aquaria and so on. But you can simply look at this empirically, or pretty much empirically. This is the kind of feeder that is being developed at the moment, been in use with various degrees of sophistication over the last 20 years or so. And basically, on the right-hand side, you can see a schematic of a fish cage. And this snaking lines of cables, these are tubes carrying food to the individual fish cages. And working back here, you can see a feed hopper and a pump. and behind that you can see a feed blower, which is just compressed air. And all of this is connected to a computer, a computerized system run by specialist software, and you have with that the computer and software are getting a lot of information from sensors that are deployed within the fish cages. And they're looking at things like temperature, dissolved oxygen, currents, and so on, and this changes how they, in the algorithms, this changes how much food they release and how frequently. But the key thing is the camera system that is often fitted at the bottom of a cage. And what that does is it photographs looking upwards, and its job is to detect how long after food has been given to the fish does it begin to see uneaten food pellets dropping through. It may not stop the feeders immediately. There may be something in the algorithm that says keep going for another 5 seconds or 10 seconds, but typically that's what happens. And this system tracks the fish's ingestion of food over time. So it's tracking it without really understanding why these changes are happening. But this has been found to be a very effective way of reducing one of the key wastes from fish farms. You can also do something about the digestibility of feed. This is technology that's been developed in the last few decades. It's what's called a steam extruder or an extruder mill. They're very common now. They're widely used for salmon and trout farms, and they're increasingly used in the tropics as well. And what they do is, at very high pressure and at very high temperature, and with raw materials that have got a certain amount of carbohydrate in it, and they squeeze this stuff through a die, and as it does so, you get expansion of the pellets, pulling in air, and this does a couple of things. It makes the pellets float, and a lot of fish are surface feeders, so they'll come up and feed, and this reduces losses, or can do if used properly. And the second thing it does is the high pressure and the steam cause physical and chemical changes to the food that make it much more digestible for most species. And it's expensive, it's sophisticated to use. You need proper engineers who know exactly what they're doing to run this sort of equipment, but it is now even beginning to make its presence felt in tropical developing countries. So these are a couple of ways of stopping producing so much waste in the first instance. And here's another one. This is the other one, which is, well, okay, you've still got waste being produced in your system. How do you capture it? And here we see two conventional systems. A big fish pond here in the left, which still produces the majority of our aquaculture products. And on the right, the fish cage. And you can imagine here, as these guys are harvesting this pond, they're stirring up a lot of mud, but also uneaten food and so on that's sedimented during the growing season. So the key to protecting the environment here is to, if you're partly draining the pond or draining the pond to harvest the fish, you do it very carefully. If you have the opportunity, and many farms do this, they have a sump to collect the solids as well when the drainage water is taken out. And then you can use things like constructed wetlands to polish the wastes. And in some places, excuse me, you can even reuse the wastewater as an irrigation, a source of irrigation water. On the right-hand side, though, these open pen net systems are much more difficult to retrieve the waste. Many things have been tried, but they're not effective, particularly in high-energy environments. To cut down escapes, people are borrowing recently. You can make stronger materials so they don't get damaged so easily, but you can also apply things like the HACCP process, which many of you will be familiar with, which is a way of identifying where the problems are and how you control these problems. And in Scotland recently, they've applied this to fish escapes, which is a major bone of contention throughout Western Europe with escaped salmon and their impacts on wild salmon populations. And what they managed to do is substantially reduce the numbers of escaped salmon by understanding exactly where the problems occur and how to minimize them. And the farms, initially reluctant to get involved in this project, are now very happy because they're saving money, they're not losing fish, and the public's happy. So we're all happy. There are also new, more radical technologies coming into the conventional pond and cage systems that are being used. These are what are called recycle aquaculture systems. They've been around for a few years. They borrow a lot of the technology from wastewater management. They're shore-based. And what you do is you pump the seawater ashore, and then you run it through your aquaculture system, these two big tanks and the schematic there on the right-hand side. And then they go through a series of filters, sterilizers using UV light, aerators, etc., to restore the water to good condition for the fish, and then it's just reused. And in a system like this, you could reuse probably something like 95% of the water. And the great thing is there are no escapes, there is no waste release into the environment, and from the farmer's point of view, it's also biosecure. The problem is they're very expensive to do this, and so far very few have proved economically viable. They're also technically complex, and I think, to be fair, we're still learning how best to design and use these. But increasingly, and with an increasing amount of confidence, these farms are now beginning to appear, but they still represent only a very small part of total production. You heard about IMTA, Integrated Multi-Trophic Aquaculture. This is a particular experimental system, and it's what we call hydroponics, or aquaponics, I should say. And here, typically in a covered system like this on the left, you're producing fish. In this case, this is in Florida. This is red drum, saltwater fish, and you're recycling the saltwater to grow a crop. In this case, it's sea purslane. It's much more commonly done with fresh water, and people see this as a real opportunity in small island developing states, in particular places where you can grow fresh vegetables and herbs. I would have to say for the top end of the market, but nonetheless in a place which has got water shortages, or parts of the world with water shortages, it's a good idea. This is the IMTA, this is how it works. I'll skip past this slide and show you a more interesting graphic, I think. This is basically how it works. You've got your intensively fed or farmed fish in the middle here. There's uneaten food and fecal waste coming out, and you've got dissolved waste as the particles break down in the water, and these are taken up by seaweed. And the particulate waste can be captured by a number of crops, such as sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and indeed scallops and mussels as well. And this is slowly taking off. There's something like 40 experimental or pilot scale systems that have been in operation in Europe over the last decade, and none have yet really got traction and are working commercially. But people are trying and learning and trying and learning. So, in summary, aquaculture, which although maybe several millennia old, we reckon about 4 or 5 millennia old, not as old as agriculture, but goes back a long way. It really must be considered as a modern technology. It's only in the last few decades that it's made any substantial contribution to food security and nutrition, and we've got a lot to learn. There are also animals that are very different from us. You know, these are weird things like fish and shellfish that we don't naturally understand as well as when we're farming mammals. So the key things here we need to do are to develop better food and feeding systems to reduce food losses. We need more biosecure systems and better management that minimize fish escapes. Recycle aquaculture systems, including IMTA, are some of the provide some options for the future, but they're capital and energy intensive. Question about their reliability, and still a question about their profitability. This that I've just run through very quickly is a subset of a whole number of issues surrounding the future of aquaculture and where it is going to go. But we'll leave it for now. So thank you.
Is there one question?
Thank you. Catherine, that's a question from Flanders Marine Institute. Fascinating. I hear you specifically talk about process and output effects. regulations are available for the input, so the food that is coming into this aquaculture system? Is there any threat there? Because it's an important factor in the sustainability of the activity.
Yes, thank you for that question. Food is critical. A number of major things have happened. If you look at the salmon industry alone, going back to about 1990, 25, 30 years ago, they were using probably about 25-30% fish meal in the diets. Today, it's a quarter of that. The food conversion ratio, the amount of food required to produce a set amount of fish, was about 3.5 to 1. These days, it's about 1.2 to 1. So it's been a huge saving in the amount of food, a huge saving in some of the key feed ingredients like fish meal and fish oil, which are scarce, that we're not making anymore. We will never have any more than we've got at present, really. But people are now looking into a whole set of alternatives, and these, I think, will come on stream in the next decade or so. Like seaweed that we heard about, that's one. The Norwegians are also experimenting with bark and small branches from trees to convert this into carbohydrate that you give to yeasts to produce bioethanol, and you use the yeast as a byproduct as the animal feed. So there's a lot of clever thinking going on about this. But there's one thing that I would caution. We eat fish because, yes, we enjoy it, but we also think it's very nutritious and it's very good for us. And there may be a danger if we go too far down the road of not focusing on the quality of the nutrition value of the animal we're farming, that this will get left behind in the race to produce just a cheaper food. And that would be my caution in this.
Thanks again, Anton. Now we will turn to our last presentation in this session. We're very happy to welcome Lorenzo Matakenaus, the CEO of Caronte Tourist. So we're very happy to have you with us. We aim to
thank you very much.
points, including
I am the bad guy.
No,
You're all very interesting. I'm the one who's using the sea to ship cars, trucks, and people, so I'm the bad guy.
no, you.
Nice to meet you all.
You're contributing to international trade.
I'm joking.
So we are happy
So-
to have you here. So you have the floor.
Thank you. And What do you see?
I used the mouse, sorry, just
Okay.
yeah.
You just tap?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I will try to be very quick. I will give you a brief introduction on what is going on into the shipping industry and what will happen in the next 3-4 years in the shipping industry. Not taking it from the environmental point of view, but taking it from the regulatory framework. The aim for our business is to reduce emissions by 2050 by 50%. IMO has lately IMO came out lately with a statement, and so we will try to do our best to reach the goal of basically cutting off the emissions of 50%. This is quite interesting. I've been curious. I was curious on how much transportation and generally shipping contributes to the pollution in the world. And as you can see, we are a big, relevant part of the overall pollution that is produced in the world. On the other hand, we are quite efficient if you think about the tons of CO2 that are produced per ton of product transported. So let's say that shipping is quite clean but since we do transport, since 90% of goods are transported on the sea, it's the amount of emissions is quite relevant. Those are the main goal that the European community is trying to reach together with the rest of the world. I prepared this slide to underline the amount of money that is available for those changes. I would say that generally speaking, our economy has been leading the 20th century using technologies that were produced during the war. Hopefully the next millennium, the next century will see us using technologies that are produced to save emissions. And in this sense, the European community is betting a lot. They're investing a lot of money into research, and there is a lot of money to research and both build new infrastructure that can guarantee a lower level of emissions. Basically, there are three lines which the European community is working on. The first one is to reduce the emissions, so to work on the fuels that are used on ships. The second one is the Water Ballast Convention, which has been explained before by some other speakers, and then the ship recycling. So those are the three main regulations that will enter into force in the next 3 years. One, it's focusing on the problem of water ballast, which is once again the risk of transporting biodiversity from Singapore to New York without knowing it. So most probably ship owners will be forced to install on their ships systems to destroy, to sterilize the waters. Ship recycling, at the moment in the European community, you cannot recycle a ship. It means that it's illegal to scrap a ship, which ends up in selling your ship to a Turkish company that sells it to a company from Pakistan, which throws the ship on shore and waits for people to dismantle it. So this is, of course, unacceptable, and the European community finally is coming out with a regulation for that. And as we all know, the European community has even tackled the issue of CO2, SOx, and NOx, and PMI, which are the emissions that are produced by burning fuel that is coming from oil. All those three regulations, they will come out with money available to invest. As you can see, both the ballast water management and the CO2 control, they both require a consistent amount of investment. And the European community is making sure that there are money available for those issues. Just for the infrastructuring of ports of core ports into Europe, we have 28.5 billion euros available. Unfortunately, in the last 3 years, we've only been able to spend 600 million in Europe, and 3.5 million only in Italy. Out of 28,000 millions available in Italy, we only spent 3. So there are money available. The problem is that those money are not being spent at the moment because there is a lack of good products. Speaking about the possibility of cutting emissions, the European community has been identifying different fuels to reduce emissions. Caronte and Tourist has chosen to focus on the last one, which is LNG, which is a fuel, which is basically it's gas that contains less CO2, less NOx. It does not contain any SOx, and it does not contain basically any PMI. But there are other tools to do that. There are scrubbers available, and there are other possibilities. We do, our colleague from France before has pointed out the fact that I have a different number, but it's 800 million or 1,000 million tons of CO2 produced per year in the shipping industry. Once again, it's 2.5 of the overall emissions, but once again, it's 90% of goods that are moving in the world. The European community has put aside, as I said before, 28 billion euros to build infrastructures into ports that will allow us to use different fuels than the ones that we are using today. Caronte Tourist is the first company in the Mediterranean Sea that has been ordering a ship that is running on LNG. The ship will be delivered in 10 months from now. What are the opportunities? So once we started to focus on this problem, and once we started our thinking on how we could reduce the emissions, we did find out that by implementing LNG, we would have been beneficial even for other businesses that are cooperating with us, or that are geographically close to us, which is the mechanization of small local networks. Sicily is surrounded by 14 small islands, which are producing their energy by using oil, gas oil. Efficient municipal fleets, in terms, which means that basically all the towns that will have an infrastructure that can be used to fill up ships with LNG. The same infrastructure can fill up buses or taxis or other kind of public transportations. An LNG station in our area would close the corridor from Malta to Helsinki, which is one of the main corridors that are identified in the European community. Basically, it can even be, once you have LNG on a small island, you can even develop a local network that can provide gas to the houses and to their kitchens. I always, I was preparing for this little speech, and I want to finish my 7 minutes by underlining two numbers which I find very interesting. First of all, the first of those two numbers is written here. Ships are using about 477,000 tons of gas oil per year. Trucks are using 17 million tons of oil per year. So obviously the problem of emissions, it's not a problem that will be solved on the sea. It's a problem that can start. It can have its start at the sea, because ship owners are obviously less than truckers, so it's easier to convince ship owners. On the other hand, I think that if truckers are not involved into this, the effect will be very little. The second number I want to underline is that we do speak about pollution at sea, but we should all start from I guess you all know, I did not know, and I guess most of the people out there, they don't know, that 70% of the pollution that you can measure in the sea is produced on land. So if you do want to solve the problem of pollution at the sea, you should start working on land, not at the sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. policy, we totally agree that many sectors have to make some efforts indeed to cut off emissions, to reduce pollution. And you're absolutely right in terms of the pollution coming from the land to the sea. But as we see many actors in what we call the ocean economy, developing new activities, there needs also to be specific regulations targeting some of these actors. So I totally get your point that indeed seafaring in principle is more or less polluting, obviously, than many of the transport activities that go on inland. But still,
No. I started saying that we will cut the 50% emissions, so we are aware of the fact that there is a lot that can be done, and that a lot has been done, and that a lot can be done. On the other hand, since it's a surviving mechanism, if we don't all work together, we will perish altogether. So I was just underlining the fact that we all have to work. And
any question for our friend?
Yes, sir. If I could just ask a question. I haven't been involved in anything to do with shipping for many years, but about 7 years ago, there was one particular company I was involved with who were looking at short sea shipping powered by sailing again. And obviously with advances in multi-disciplinary types of sail arrangements and computer control of sailing, it seemed to be not a ridiculous proposition. And the other one that was kicking around about 7 years ago was the use of small modular reactors. So these small modular reactors. So these are nuclear reactors designed to power a small town in the United States. And there was a lot of contentious debate about whether these could ever be used for shipping. But has anything been done in perhaps the more left field, more radical aspects of the last 7 years?
I will not give you any comments on the oil tankers sailing in the Pacific Ocean, because obviously that's not the case. That's just an effect of the price of oil being $120 per ton. So at the moment, right in that moment, you're speaking about everybody was speaking about everything, because it's not convenient, it's not predictable. The problem with which is that it's not predictable. You can predict that your engine will be working 10 hours a day, and that you will be making 12 miles per hour. If you have to transport whatever you need to transport from A to B, you cannot be waiting for the minute. So that's not an option. Very few people know that there was a time where nuclear propulsion was allowed on commercial ships. In 1947, the first nuclear commercial ship was launched in the United States. Since then, somebody has been thinking about the possibility of somebody making a ship blow into a port. And lately, somebody has been thinking about the possibilities of somebody taking the exhaust fuel and to take it somewhere else. So I don't think you will see that ever in your life due to security reasons. I mean, it could be very convenient, speaking from an economical point of view, but from a political point of view, I don't think it's quite sensitive, and basically all the regulations on how you build a ship, they should be changed, because not everybody knows that the Navy builds its vessels, its ships, because they can avoid following some of the rules that we have on how to build a ship.
So with this, I would like to thank all the speakers in this session. I think it was very rich and a lot of very useful information that fits directly in some of the analysis that we conducted. So thanks again very much for having joined us. And with this, I have a round of applause.
afternoon. I will welcome you all to the session 2 that will open at an opening now and will be ended tomorrow in the morning. We will have 4 speakers. One is connected by Skype, Mike Elliott. I don't know if you can see. Yes, okay, you can see. But for today, we will have just 1 speaker, so it will be light, not in terms of quality, but in terms of quantity sessions, because Mark Cowerley was not feeling so well, so he asked me to switch on tomorrow morning. Hopefully he will rest this night and will be better today. So this session is on the commissioning of marine infrastructure and ecosystem preservation, and the first and also the last speaker of today is Roberto Cimino, is Vice President at ENI.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Hello. Okay, good. Good evening, everybody. I have a challenge here because we are probably 10 minutes to the cocktail, so I will have to close the meeting while not bothering you and let's say leading the discussion to the cocktail. So let me start. First of all, a few words about ENI. We are an oil and gas and energy company. 60 billion revenues per year, 30,000 plus employees. We are working in oil and gas production, so we know quite well onshore production, but also offshore production. And this is why we are interested in decommissioning infrastructure. So I've been asked to present to you, to discuss briefly the status of infrastructure, what they are, how they look like, what are the main challenges, and the perspective taking into account, of course, economics and innovation, which are the 2 keywords of our meeting today. So let's start with the commission. What are the infrastructure? Basically, offshore infrastructure are facilities which are designed to produce oil and gas. The depth ranges from few meters, tens of meters, 20 meters in shallow water, down to 3,000 meters in the very deep water production. We are talking of facilities very diverse. We are also talking, we have to keep in mind that when we are talking of facilities, offshore facilities, we are also talking on underwater producing wells and pipelines connecting the facilities to the shore. So it's a very complicated network of steel and plants. Okay? Typically, the weight can go from, let's say, a few hundred tons to thousands of tons, and so the decommissioning can be very challenging in terms of impact, as you will see in a few minutes. How many offshore platforms do we have worldwide? This is let's say an estimate from Society of Petroleum Engineers, SP, which is the largest professional organization in this field. They estimate 9,000 plus platforms in service, as you can see. The 2 gravitational poles of offshore platform concentration in the world are the North Sea, around 1,700 facilities, and the Gulf of Mexico, 5,000 facilities more or less. You can see here gas producing, oil producing. This is between the UK and Holland. This is between UK and Norway. This is the situation of the Gulf of Mexico. You have facilities in the shallow waters, so this means down to 300 meters. These are facilities in the so-called deep water, 2,500 meters, more or less. And this is ultra deep water, so beyond, even deeper than that. This is as far as the number is concerned. Many of these facilities face retirement now because they are aging. How many projects are we talking about, and what is the size, let's say, of this activity in the years to come? There is a very recent study which came out from IHS Markit, which is one of the major consultancy in the energy field. It is a report dating back in 2016. As you can see, there are 600 plus decommissioning projects in the next 5 years, 2017, 2021, and 6,000 to follow through 2040. The spending will move from a couple of $1 billion in 2015 to $13 billion in 2040, and the overall expenditure between 2021 and 2040 is estimated to be above 200 billion. So it's a huge effort. 50% of the spending will be in Europe, the rest will be Gulf of Mexico, Indonesia, and Australia. So this is more or less what we are talking about. How a typical decommissioning is carried out. You have different opportunities. It depends on the water depth, it depends on the weight, it depends on the type of structure. But basically, you can remove the facilities, completely remove the facility, and take it away. That's the remove can be relocated in some cases. You can cut off part of the facility, leaving the total facility on the sea bottom after careful, of course, environmental impact analysis. In some cases, you can, let's say, leave the structure as it is on the bottom of the sea. Normally, you do the first option. Okay? What do you do with the pipelines? Either you remove the pipelines or you cover the pipelines, either with mattresses or with sand to, let's say, try to reconstitute the environmental landscape that was, let's say, present before those infrastructure were built. Clearly, one important aspect is the impact that those facilities have during the decommissioning, but also during the life. So we have to take a look, especially in the decommissioning phase, at the atmosphere, because these operations, as you have seen, are carried out by huge vessels, huge cranes, so and last months, because it's a huge work. You can have alteration of the seabed, alteration of the water column, impact on ecosystem and marine life, as well as socio-economic impact in terms of shipping, fisheries, tourism, if you are close to areas where tourism is present. Okay, so this is basically one key aspect. When you look at decommissioning, you have to take into consideration the environmental, let's say, aspects, and environmental monitoring is very important to take into account that the operation is carried out in the proper way. Moving to the perspective and moving to the innovation, I would like to start from what we said just a few minutes ago. Environment is very important. From this point of view, I agree with some of the colleagues which came before me. Marine robotics, it's really one of the frontiers that we have in front of us. In the last 15 years, there have been enormous progress in robotics technology in terms of sensors, in terms of computing capability and possibility to implement in a small space, as it is in this case, computing capabilities able to provide both systems with a good degree of autonomy, in terms of batteries to provide autonomy to these vehicles. I'm presenting here what we have developed within our company, but there are many examples around the world. We call this technology Clean Sea. Basically, it's an autonomous technology with a payload, and these, let's say, cylindrical objects which are put beneath the structure are basically equipped with sensors, video camera, and batteries, electronics, and these can be autonomous up to 8 hours, can go down to 3,000 meters marine depth, can sample seawater, can carry out environmental sampling, characterize, can carry out visual, acoustic, and bathymetric inspection of seabed, so it can determine, let's say, the shape of the seabed, and also can carry out automatic pipeline tracking. As you can see, the size is very, let's say, limited. It's quite small, so it can be operated from a small vessel. You don't need those huge, let's say, ships that in some cases are used to carry out the same type of measurements. One interesting feature is that this vehicle, you can preset a route of the vehicle, so you can tell the vehicle to carry out a route like this, for instance, on the bottom of the sea. But the built-in computing power and algorithm provides also for the possibility, if the vehicle finds out a spot where the concentration, for instance, of hydrocarbon is higher than a certain threshold, it can decide autonomously to stay there, to carry out let's say a survey, a local survey, increasing the number of points, and then to go on, let's say, carrying out this mission. So it's really autonomous, and it's able to make decisions based on the signals that the sensors provide to the central intelligence unit. This is what it is possible to do today, and it's a wave, let's say, of innovation and progress which began from transforming the ROV to autonomous vehicle. The future will be basically the capability of having completely autonomous systems by providing recharging systems on the bottom of the sea. We are working on that. We think that this can be 3 to 5 years from now. It's not so far. This would provide the possibility of this system to stay on the seabed and stay there for months, basically. Because the other alternatives would be rely on enormous amount of battery power and energy, which is for the time being really difficult to foresee in the foreseeable future. In addition, it is possible to provide for manipulation capabilities, and also by optical communication between the units, to build collaborative units, swarm of robots able to carry out different tasks on the bottom of the sea. So from the point of view of environmental monitoring, I would say that this is the frontier we see coming in the next years, 5, 10, maybe more 10 than 5. What can we do in terms of, let's say, infrastructure in addition to well monitoring the environment? Well, basically, we can think of reusing this infrastructure in some cases by, for instance, building artificial reef on the structure which is undersea, by coupling this structure with, for instance, wind power or solar power, and by providing aquaculture, let's say, in the surroundings of the facility. We are, of course, talking of facilities which are not producing any longer, this is an alternative to decommission the facilities. It's basically a circular economy concept, extending the lifetime and providing value in other let's say, areas. Of course, this is a project we are studying so far together with Anton Dohrn and other universities. It has to be taken into careful account the impact of those activities on the environment, as well as the technical, economic, and feasibility. It's pretty much dependent on where the structure is located. Is it close to the shore? Is it, let's say, on 100-meter depth to 2,000-meter depth? So it has to be studied case by case, but we are trying to build a comprehensive model able to drive us, hopefully, in a couple of years from now, to have, let's say, a tool for deciding when it's the case to decommission, when it's the case to reuse the facility, and which is the best option to reuse the facilities itself. So, concluding, what we see for this, let's say, infrastructure, offshore infrastructure, oil and gas offshore infrastructure in the future, let's say 2030, to put a date, a future date. Well, basically, of course, together with the commissioning, which will have to take place in many cases, maybe most of the cases, we can think of implementing renewable energy, also wave energy, not only wind and solar, aquaculture, we spoke of aquaculture, and thanks to robotics, this structure could become a hub for environmental monitoring and marine monitoring where they are located. They are available, they are there. If there is not much of an impact in terms of environment, they could even help the environment by providing, let's say, infrastructure which have the possibility to gather energy, maybe from the wave, charge the battery, and having this swarm of robots or underwater autonomous vehicles able to carry out, let's say, environmental inspection on the sea. That's all. Thank you so much.
So we have time for questions. And there's one there. Please use the microphone, so just although also Mike Elliott is connected to the others.
Thank you for a very good presentation. Thank you for a very good presentation. And it was the first time here today I heard the word circular economy, and I think that we have to put much more stress on it than we have done before up to now, I would say. And I think that talking about circular economy, then your starting point shall not be the decommissioning issue. It shall be built in from the very beginning in the design phase.
Of course, I perfectly agree. The concept of circular economy is designing the structure so that it minimizes the waste, maximizes the use. That's perfectly true. Comment on your words, I agree completely, but we are talking of structures which have been designed 30 years ago, 40 years ago, so none of this concept has been implemented. This is a way, reusing these structures, let's say, to capture part of circular economy. I'm not claiming that we are building a perfect, out of the books of the manual circular economy concept. No, you're right. But nevertheless, these are options that we might take into consideration by carefully studying if the impact is less than the benefit, and by doing so, we avoid taking out the structure from the sea. And what do you do with these tons of metals that you have in any case there? You cannot reuse as they are, probably you have to dispose. So it's an option that I think it is worthwhile to consider. Thank you for your comment in any case.
Other questions? I have one.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there's one.
I come back here. You don't want the cocktail. I'm talking.
I'm trying to be polite and be the last man before the cocktail, so you don't have to carry the responsibility for it.
No problem. No, I'm here to answer your questions, so enjoy. No problem.
Do you already have an idea, looking now over the next 5 years, and say at least in the North Sea, do you have any sense of what percentage of the decommissioning projects will in fact find an alternative use? Is it talking about a large share, a small share? Do you have a sense of
which part of the commissioning project can...
Which percentage, shall we say, of the commissioning projects are likely to be reused? Either for aquaculture purposes,
I don't think so many. I see a phase of testing and experimentation which has to be carried out. One important aspect I did not mention, but it's an aspect it's worthwhile to underline, is building confidence among stakeholders. Because if you take a look at the legislation in many parts of the world, in the Mediterranean is for sure like that, you couldn't do anything of what I've showed to you now. So we need to carry out experiments on real structures. We need to monitor, to show to the stakeholders, local communities, regional authorities, national and supranational regulators, that this is a way we can proceed to. So I don't think it will be many projects in the next 5 years. Beyond 5 years, if we are able and good to test and to, let's say, show that this is a viable way in terms of minimizing the impact and so on, I think that this industry can take off. But in the next 5 years, definitely we need testing and experimenting. That's my conclusion.
Thank you. I'll change my question as a short comment before podcast. You mentioned during your presentation several times environmental monitoring.
Yeah.
It is necessary to take in account that for doing real environmental monitoring, it will be necessary to consider biological conditions and not only chemical or physical conditions. And it's a very huge lack, because 90% of the sensors that you are on your automatic robotic system are not measuring any biological data, but only chemical and physical data.
Yeah, correct. This is depending on the type of sensor we can put on the let's say on the cylinder with the vessel. But today the system can sample the water. We can, in one of the versions, we can sample the water, and I presume, I'm not a biologist, but I presume that you can carry out some, at least, characterization in terms of biological characteristics. So this is what we can do today. Yes, you're right. Probably we have to think to move sensors probably in the direction of measuring biological variables, because it is probably the most important indirect indicator.
For us, the most important. So if any have some money left, you can invest in.
Okay. I will go back and ask my management to put more money on the project. You will support me.
So if there's any other questions, we can close the session and open the cocktail.